Well, hello there and good morning, Cascadia. I'm James Steinbach, and I'm here to talk about building modal windows for everyone. When I say a modal window or a modal dialog, here's the kind of component we're talking about today. We're going to learn how to build a pop-up. It takes over the mode of the page. That's why it's called modal. It's not just the document being available, but now just this one rectangle in the middle of the document. Also, a modal dialog contains interactive content. The user has to interact with it, fill out a form, consent to terms and conditions they've read, something that requires a user to take action. And we're going to talk about building these so that all our users, sighted, trackpad, keyboard, screen reader, the whole gamut, are covered and have an accessible, inclusive, good experience. And we're going to talk about doing that not for React or Vue or Ember or anything, not for WordPress or Drupal or even like Jekyll or Hugo or Eleventy. We're going to talk about basics like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, these cool languages you might have heard of. And we're going to use these tools to make an experience, a pattern that can be used in any context and is inclusive for everyone, but isn't framework or build tool specific. This is advice that's great for everyone in any dev environment. So first, let's lay our foundation, HTML for baseline accessibility. Here's kind of an MVP for markup for a starting place. Don't memorize this slide. You can come back to it. Also, there's a link at the bottom of your screen. That's a live link to these slides. You can read them, follow along, refer back to them. There are plenty of links in the slides themselves to additional resources where time didn't permit me to dive deeper. So let's take this element apart. First off, semantically, we've got to identify the element as a modal dialog, the definition we just gave, for screen readers and their users. So we use an element dialog, not div or section, dialog. And then we're also going to make this role equals dialog. And that feels a little duplicaty, right? It kind of feels like maybe 7 or 8 years ago when every template or theme you downloaded for a popular platform was main role equals main and footer role equals footer. And yeah, that was kind of redundant, but it was necessary because the element, the tag name was newer and had less browser support, but it was the future and everything was moving that direction. The role had better support, but was going to be dropped in favor of the element itself. So that's where we are now. Dialog is a little less supported than role, so we're going to use them both to cover a wider range of devices and apps. And then aria modal equals true communicates to the screen reader that our element is going to take over the mode of the page when it's open. Now that we know what it is, we've got to say which one it is. So give it a good title. If your modal has a title element inside of it, give it an ID, and then the dialog should have aria labeled by the ID of that heading element. If there's not a visible title in your modal, then your dialog should have aria label equals, and then a sensible title for the modal. This will be read aloud by screen readers, so make sure it communicates both the function of the modal, edit post, and what thing it's doing, post name. So give it a good, clear name so that a user with a screen reader can immediately close if it's the wrong place or proceed with confidence if they are in the right place. That's our dialog itself. Now let's talk about the buttons that control it, more HTML. And when I say buttons, I mean buttons. I don't mean divs with a click event attached to them. I don't mean links with prevent default and then JavaScript functions attached to them. I mean buttons. Links take you to different pages. Buttons change the state of the current page, and divs just don't change things. They're just divs. So here are the buttons we want. In the normal flow of the document is a button that will open the modal. It should have aria controls equals the ID of the modal itself. And yes, as the linked article here is titled, aria controls is poop. It's not entirely worthless, but it doesn't create an awesome, cool, magical relationship between the button and the element that it controls. However, it has some useful function for us as a selector, and we'll see that in a few slides. We're also going to put a button inside the modal, and that'll close the modal. In the DOM, you want this near the beginning, so again, the user has an opportunity to close the modal quickly if they're not where they want to be. This button is probably not going to have words in it, usually an icon, the little diagonal cross or an X. So here are 2 links on how to include a string of text that's with CSS, hidden from sighted users, but read aloud for screen readers. And then also a link on using an SVG icon in a button in a way that's accessible and not distracting to screen readers. We're also going to have a button behind the modal, And this is a cool bonus button. It's the scrim, that layer of kind of like semi-transparent, maybe white or gray or black or blue or what have you from the brand color that makes the text behind the modal, the rest of the page, look dim. You can use a semi-transparent button for that. And then boom, it's super easy to catch clicks outside of the modal for that close function. Now that we know about the dialog and the buttons that control it, let's wire things up. Let's talk about interactivity and JavaScript. First off, we're going to toggle visibility. JavaScript has to change a few attributes at the open and close events. When the modal is open, you should have the open attribute on your dialog. And when the modal is closed, that dialog element should have aria hidden true and inert. Inert is a lot newer, and it's got a polyfill. Not even all of our modern evergreen browsers support inert yet, so there's a good polyfill here. Aria hidden true is better supported, and so that serves as a good fallback. We include them both so that we cover a wide range of assistive tech applications and operating systems. When we open the modal, we remove aria hidden, we remove inert, and we set open. And then when we close the modal, we put aria hidden true, inert, and we remove open. Another place you might want to use your close event is on that click outside the modal. I recommend the button scrim. Other folks would rather listen for any click on document and then say, is this event target inside the modal? And is the modal open? And then fire a close event. But again, the button is simpler overall. And then listen for a key up event for the escape key and close the modal when the user hits escape to leave. That was state management. Let's talk about focus management for a moment. When you open the modal, programmatically put focus on the modal's title or the container itself. And whichever element you choose, you'll need to put tab index 0 on that element so that you can programmatically focus on it with JavaScript. While it's open, we need to trap focus inside the modal. That means we don't let the user tab or screen reader navigate their way out of the modal into the rest of the page while the modal is still open. So we listen for blur events, and then there's a next property on that event. And if the element in next is outside of the modal, hijack that event and bring the user around to the opposite end of the modal. Remember, there's tab and shift tab, so watch going forwards and backwards for focus trapping. And then third, when we close the modal, here's that aria controls attribute I warned you about. We can use this attribute selector to restore focus to the button that opened the modal. Put the user back where they were before they interacted with your modal and let them continue navigating the page from that same location. Now that's JavaScript. Let's talk about some CSS, and this is a short part. Here's some CSS recommendations I have for you. Hook your CSS up to the aria hidden attribute selector and not a class like is closed or is open. And what this does is now your CSS is written in a way that it documents you gotta use this aria attribute that gives screen readers the information they need. It doesn't allow a dev, hopefully it doesn't allow a dev in the future, whether it's you or somebody else, to come by in a few months, make another modal and just use an is closed class to toggle visibility. It reminds people, hey, this aria attribute is necessary. Now, when you toggle visibility, don't use display none to hide it. Use visibility hidden, and there are two reasons I recommend this. First off, iOS VoiceOver has a bug right now. When you bring a modal out of display none into visibility, into display block, for example, you can't programmatically focus on it. iOS just kind of breaks and it doesn't work. So use visibility hidden instead, and you won't need any of the Stack Overflow JavaScript workarounds for that bug. Secondly, if you use display none, you can't put CSS transitions on that element, like out of opacity or transform scale 0, for example. CSS transitions do work, as expected, as hoped, if you use visibility hidden to hide the modal. Now, for performance sake, we want to have smooth animations, so stick with opacity and transform. That's old advice. You've heard it before, I'm sure. And then here's one. There's a media query called prefers reduced motion. Respect that. If the user doesn't want motion, scale it way back or remove motion almost entirely from your animations. You got to handle scrolling well. Have a scrolling container inside the modal so it doesn't have to be taller than the viewport. And then while the modal's open, handle scrolling on the body. Prevent it from happening at all, in fact. CSS-only modals are cool and look fun on CodePen, but they don't communicate open and closed state, and they don't trap focus, so they're no good for prime time. So what about JavaScript dependency and progressive enhancement? Great question. Here's progressive enhancement for a modal. put the modal on a separate page, and then bring the same markup in as a dialog when JavaScript is running. Thanks so much. You have been a great audience. Here are some more resources for you. I hope they're a help. And if you want to get in touch with me, I'm James. I love talking more about accessibility, different use cases. So hit me up on Twitter, my blog, that kind of stuff. Have a great rest of your Cascadia.
Yay! Awesome work, James.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for that talk.
Cool.
Oh, that was, I love talking about accessibility, and especially modals, because modals I feel like are the thing that every web dev has to touch at some point. And we don't always do it right. Are there any particular quirks outside of what you talked about for building accessible modals that you've had to run into?
One thing is like that visibility hidden recommendation I made. Browser user agent style sheets do use display none, so you have to override the browser's native CSS. Ran into that actually just last night debugging a modal.
There have also been a few questions about scrims. Could you go into a bit more detail about what a scrim is and the accessibility around that?
Sure. So like the word comes from theater and stage performances. They would hang like a thin sheet behind the stage and performers could do silhouetted acting work behind it. And that's the same word we use for that kind of semi-transparent background that goes behind the modal, but in front of the page content to prevent you from clicking into the content. And the reason why I saw a lot of Slack comments, the reason why we would want to have an ARIA hidden attribute on that element is otherwise you end up with two close buttons. The one that natively appears in the modal, the one you put up in the corner, and then now another one behind the modal. And so that's just a safety thing to keep a screen reader from duplicating that part of the UI and pestering a user with multiple requests to do the same action.
Interesting. And so you could almost have some kind of click outside detector with that scrim to be able to be like, well, if you click outside of the modal, that's a way to close it, sort of?
The button catches the clicks, so we don't need complicated JavaScript to manage clicks on the body or document.
Interesting. Okay, that I have officially wrapped my mind around it. That makes a lot more sense. Cool. Do you have any particular testing strategies when it comes to modals? Do you do any sort of unit testing, or do you go straight to end-to-end integration type testing for them?
So most of my testing personally is actual like in the browser with my keyboard with a screen reader, testing it like a user would. The team I work on is split between front of the front end, accessibility and style experts, and then JavaScript engineers who do app architecture. And so they're writing the test suites. So yeah, with them, we would work to make sure that clicks trigger all the right attribute changes and get that all spec'd out in a test.
Neat. Do you have any tool recommendations for that kind of stuff?
Yeah, like I use VoiceOver on macOS and iOS. Normally when testing, if you have a Windows machine, unfortunately I don't, but with a Windows machine, I would install NVDA or JAWS to do the same thing. And yeah, like a real human, there's really not a substitute automated for tabbing through the site and testing it as a regular user would.
Yeah, for sure. We're starting to run out of time, but are there any browser support changes that we should be aware of when it comes to modals and figuring out how to make them better and accessible and everything? Are there any things we should pay attention to?
Right now, Firefox is a flag. You have to enable to get it open, so it should be fully working in Firefox, hopefully. In a future release, it's not terribly far away. In Safari, it's down the road. It's got the little red X through it on MDN, unfortunately. And the good news is a dialog element just acts like a div if the browser doesn't have a definition for a dialog element, which is where we put role dialog on and handle the accessibility stuff with additional ARIA attributes.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for your talk. I'm also peeping your brass instruments back there, fellow brass players. But anyway, thank you again so much for your talk, James. I learned something. I hope everybody else did too. The chat was hopping, full of all kinds of resources and being excited about your talk. But now I think it's time for our day one break, our morning break. So thank you again so much, James, and we're off to the next thing.
Thank you.